Chapter 6. It was getting late. The rain had started again. The protagonist tottered down deserted streets seeking signs of life. Unlit windows and shuttered doors greeted him around every corner until, in the middle of an otherwise darkened and uninviting block of brownstones, a warm glow seemed to beckon to him. He approached the source of the light to find that it was an arcade. A neon sign blinked on and off over the entrance. Through the large pane glass window, the protagonist could see a multitude of screens flickering and illuminating children's faces like flashes of lightning, while a cacophony of discordant machine sounds blared merrily from every direction. In the back, beyond the rows of game cabinets and air hockey tables, a bored and pocked teenager manned a counter, where hard-won tickets could be redeemed for poorly sewn stuffed animals, cheap plastic toys, or small bags of artificially flavored candy. The majority of the games had hand-lettered, out-of-order signs taped to their blank and dead screens. The functioning games were each surrounded by a swarm of players and spectators, like pigs at a trough. The protagonist didn't dare enter. He was old and square and out of place. His presence would be certainly unwelcome. And besides, his tired senses would be overwhelmed by the concentrated stimulus of lights and sounds. But he watched the scene for a few moments from the quiet anonymity of the sidewalk. The games offered a multitude of exciting scenarios. This one required the player to pilot a spaceship against an alien armada. That one required the player to fight a horde of spiders with a shield and broadsword. Moving from machine to machine, a player could in turn be a boxer, or a spy, or a soldier, or a race car driver, or a voracious amorphous blob. Children flitted from one game to another seemingly at random, putting on different personas and championing different causes indiscriminately. With each coin inserted, their consciousness descended from the complex three-dimensional world of the arcade to a simple two-dimensional reality, completely contained within the boundaries of a screen. And when the words "Game Over" finally flashed, consciousness ascended once again back into this world. In and out, up and down, each player descended and ascended again and again. Each game character looked different, lived in a completely different place with a different set of rules, faced different dangers, and had very different goals in life. None of which was real, of course. It was nothing more than pixels and binary code. Well, thought the protagonist, there was one real thing about the fictional characters inhabiting the simulated worlds. The player controlling them. And no matter who that 2D character is or what it does, some small part of the descended 3D player will always shine through. And then the protagonist realized that the human controlling the video game could be considered to be the video game character's soul. In each game, it was never the character who decided to react to hardship by either giving up or becoming more determined, to fight bravely or cowardly to share its bounty, or selfishly hoard its rewards. Those were the player's decisions. Regardless of the specific rules of the game, how the character handles adversity, whether the character chooses compassion or cruelty, those are the things that reveal the character's soul. And those choices are actually an aspect of the player, not the game. Every time a new child grabbed the joystick, the tiny warrior in the virtual world reacted fundamentally differently, despite the fact that nothing in their virtual world had changed. From the character's perspective, they'd be the same person, but they'd have a different soul. For someone gazing up from a limited 2D perspective, the protagonist existed outside of time and space, not in the world, but existing above it. He could turn the world off and on at will or reset it to the beginning. He was eternal and existed in a dimension filled with concepts that would be completely beyond any tiny warrior's imagination. He was inscrutable and non-understandable, a 3D metaphysical object projecting its shadow into a two-dimensional world. The protagonist peered deeper into the arcade in amazement and watched the souls directly interacting with one another in this higher dimension. Some were helpful and encouraging to the smaller and less experienced. Some were bullies who cheated and banged their tiny fist on the cabinet with rage and jealousy. He considered the implications of a soul descending dimensions and taking on a temporary persona. When a person stops playing a game, their character ceases to exist. The character effectively dies. But the player doesn't. They go on living in the higher dimension. So does that mean that one day when the protagonist's game was over and he died here in the real world, those aspects of him that were actually his soul would go on, ascending back up into some fourth-dimensional child somewhere, only to later be reborn as another character in another universe? The protagonist wondered if, since he could exist across multiple virtual video game realities, perhaps his soul is doing just that, continuing on across multiple three-dimensional realities for eternity, a fundamental, higher-dimensional version of himself that will always be inscrutable and non-understandable to his limited 3D understanding. The protagonist suddenly recoiled in horror as a young boy inside the arcade snuck up and jumped against the window, pressing his face against the glass and sticking out his tongue. The protagonist stumbled backwards in shock. A large fog of breath was left on the window where the protagonist had been standing. Underneath, the boy grimaced and licked the glass menacingly as his fingernails scraped against the pane. The protagonist decided to move on. As he walked away, he felt his heart continue to beat heavily for some time. He regretted having left his home tonight. He'd been seeking something, he was sure of that much, but he could no longer remember what it was. But even if that elusive thing he desired couldn't be found in his warm and comfortable rooms, at least he wouldn't be here, cold and wet and alone and scared of the dark. He passed an empty lot populated with weeds and scrubs struggling out from under scattered piles of gravel, chunks of broken concrete, and spikes of rusted rebar. Huddled around a fire burning in a large metal drum, gruff, unshaven men in muddied clothes warmed their hands and drank out of brown and green bottles. They silently stared at him as he passed, with glum and menacing eyes. Just beyond the lot was a small library. A cardboard box filled with dusty books lay near the entrance, under a handwritten sign that said, "Free." As the protagonist approached the doors, a gruff man in fingerless gloves passed him, carrying an armful of books away towards the empty lot. Unexpectedly, the library appeared to still be open, despite the lateness of the hour. The protagonist entered and shook the rain off his coat. It was bright and warm inside, and he squinted until his eyes adjusted to the change. The floor of the entry was covered in slick white tiles that bore the names of people who had donated money to fund the building's construction. The protagonist walked carefully so as to not slip on the muddied footprints that covered the area by the door. A sign that read, "Art classes tonight," stood leaning against an easel. Just inside the entry was a large open area in which a dozen or so people stood around, laboring to paint a still life that consisted of a single book lying on a small table that had been draped in a dark velvet cloth. "Isn't it beautiful?" an older woman said to him dreamily as he passed. "The book?" asked the protagonist incredulously. "Of course the book," replied a man standing nearby. "We are honoring this book's beauty by painting it." "All books are beautiful," said another artist. "But this one is especially beautiful," said another. "I've heard that it won many awards for being such a great book." "The author is well renowned for writing the most beautiful books," said a fifth. "It's my hope to one day be lucky enough to paint all the greatest books ever written by all the greatest authors," said the old woman. She returned to her canvas. "This class is full," several artists shouted in unison. Looking around, there were no open easels for anyone else to join the class, so the protagonist moved past the artists without commenting further. Behind the reception desk, a librarian was busy filling out a form, but glanced up to acknowledge him. "Please refrain from making unnecessary noise in the library," she said perfunctorily. I'm looking for something that might cheer me up, said the protagonist. Can you recommend something light and jovial? We have many light books in our collection. What color do you prefer? Replied the librarian. The protagonist appeared confused. All our books are sorted by the color of their covers, she explained. Blue over there, red over here, mauve in the back by the bathrooms. Maybe you'd be interested in something on the yellow side of the spectrum? Isn't it hard to find what you're looking for if the books are sorted by color? The librarian responded, Well, all the most stylish and modern libraries are doing it this way. I suppose you have a point in that seeking out a specific title becomes a little more arduous, but that issue was almost never mentioned in any of our focus groups. And you'll have to agree that our system makes the shelves look a lot more fashionable, don't you think? Fashionable libraries are always more well attended than dull and dreary ones. The protagonist tried to translate his mood into a color. Maybe something heliotrope, he said, hesitantly, not quite remembering what that color was. Oh, good choice, sir. I can tell you are a man of the most refined style. She immediately directed him to a bookcase filled with tomes of almost iridescent purple, and suggested peat mosses and where to find them by L'Arbitraire as being the most popular and beautiful heliotrope-colored book in the library's collection. The dust cover is real gold leaf foil, she offered. Just looking at its elegance fills me to the brim with cheerfulness. She shivered mockingly to convey her enthusiasm, and then went back to filling out her form. The protagonist spent considerable time scanning the shelf he'd been directed to, but failed to find the book the librarian had suggested. It was probably out on loan. He perused some of the other heliotrope titles, but found their tone too dark for his mood. Giving up, he wandered aimlessly down the rainbow stacks until he found himself in a hallway filled with books of drab beige. The shelves here had a thin layer of undisturbed dust on them, and a brownish liquid dripped from a crack between ceiling tiles and had left a moldy stain on the carpet below. On a shelf nearest to his eye, a small spider lay tightly curled up, dead and desiccated. This section seemed to fit his mood. He took one book at random, found an unoccupied reading table in a quiet corner, and sat down in a chair that turned out to have one leg slightly shorter than the other three. Someone long ago had carved their initials into the wood of the armrest. The protagonist ran his fingers over the letters, and for a second he wondered where the person who carved them was at present. But there was no way for him to ever know what became of them, or even how long ago they sat in the chair that he now sat in. He opened the book to a random page and began to read. It was a simple story about two lazy men sitting under a tree. The two ragged and tattered characters bickered between themselves for some time about the most trifling and trivial of topics. It was pleasant and distracting enough for a while, until the protagonist arrived at an odd passage in the text. He read the words. The first man turned and looked directly at the reader and said, "Call me Ishmael." Something about the wording of that sentence seemed a bit off, but the protagonist read it a second time, and that was indeed what had been printed on the page. He even ran his fingers over the text to be sure. He moved on. The next passage in the book read, "Do not do that. His name is Diddy, not Ishmael," said the second man as he too turned to directly address the reader. "Shush, Gogo, you're giving away all our secrets," the first man replied. "You there, call me Ishmael." "You aren't Ishmael, that's an entirely different book," replied Gogo. "You're just being confusing." "Do it," said Diddy. Read the next paragraph. The protagonist stopped reading for a second and put the book down. He looked around, but the tables closest to him were empty. A few people were sitting some distance away, but they didn't seem to be mindful of his presence. He picked up the book again and lifted it close to his face. "Ishmael?" he whispered hesitantly. The next sentence written in the book was, "Ha! I knew I could make him say it." Then, Gogo threw an apple at Diddy's head. "And what exactly did that prove?" he asked his friend. Diddy triumphantly strutted and danced around the tree. "It proves once again that we possess agency, that we can project our will beyond the page, the protagonist read. I would think that was obvious, and not something you need to break the fourth wall to prove again and again, sighed Gogo, picking up the discarded apple and polishing it on the sleeve of his threadbare jacket. But you aren't real, said the protagonist of the book. You're just words someone wrote down once, nothing more. The text seemed to respond directly to him. That's only because you stubbornly define things by the simplest definition. But let me put this question to you. Who is more real, you or us? Well, obviously me, said the protagonist, surprised to find that he was arguing with a book. I mean, I'm a real person. I have a body. The next few paragraphs of the text read, A body? Diddy laughed. Gogo, he thinks he's a real person because he has a body. My good fellow, why should that be the deciding factor? How many people know your name? How many people would recognize your face if shown your photo? A few hundred, maybe? If he's lucky, said Gogo between bites of his apple. Pathetic, said Diddy, snatching the apple out of his companion's hand and taking a bite for himself. Gogo, how long has it been since these words were first written down? 50 years, maybe. 75? And how many copies of this book are there? Now, millions, Diddy, probably. Certainly more than I can count. And how many people know our names? Well, a lot more than some inconsequential fool sitting by himself in a disused corner of a library in the middle of the night with nothing better to do than read this book, that's for certain. And this fellow thinks he's more real than us just on account of how he has a body? Ha! Laughable. And don't forget, Diddy, having a body means he has a heart and it has to pump blood. He has lungs that have to take breaths. Sooner or later, something or other will fail and he'll be dead. Probably sooner than he would like by the look of him. Diddy scrutinized the reader's worn and haggard face. He's clearly on his last legs. And soon after, no one will ever think of him again. No one will ever think of him again, repeated Diddy. But we'll still be here, the two characters said in unison, having the same conversation with the next reader curious enough to pick up this book. You aren't talking to me, said the protagonist, raising his voice. You can't talk. I'm just reading words on a page. We can't talk, huh? Just because we have no mouths? Can't you hear our voices in your head? That may be so, but I'm the one making this conversation happen. You are static. You don't have agency, replied the protagonist. We don't have agency? My dear fellow, we are not men. We are ideas. We are the very definition of agency, were the next lines written in the book. Put it this way. As long as any of you flesh and blood readers exist, we will exist. As long as someone continues to think of us, we are immortal. And you will think of us. That's right. Every day someone somewhere picks up a copy of this book and thinks of us and argues with us. And every time someone opens this book, our power is renewed. The power to inspire, the power to anger, the power to change a person's thoughts and opinions about the world, about morality, about philosophy, about the nature of reality itself. We are ideas, and ideas are agency. But you, my good man, even though you will continue to think about us well after you close this book for the last time, I can promise you, with absolute certainty, that neither of us will ever, not even once, think about you. The protagonist slammed the book closed against the table. I'll show you who has agency, he exclaimed loudly. In his head, he could still hear the fictional tramps laughing at him. Almost immediately, the librarian appeared behind him and said quietly, Sir, do I have to remind you to please refrain from making unnecessary noise in the library? I'm sorry, he said in a quiet tone. Something about this book upset me. We get that a lot with the beige books. It's a hard and unpleasant color. I think I'm just overtired, said the protagonist. I should go. He stood up to put on his coat, and the librarian returned to her desk. Just as he was about to leave, he looked back at the book still lying askew on the reading table and sighed in embarrassment for letting it get to him. A patron came up to him. Oh, You've reached that book, have you? He said. The man was disheveled and looked like he had slept in the soiled tweed jacket that awkwardly draped his thin frame. His teeth were brown and rotted. I read that book once. I didn't want to, you know. I only read it because I've made it my life's work to read every single book in this library. I'm going from the blackest of the books and moving towards the whitest. I started the other way around, but then I realized that as I progressed, my mood got darker and darker, so I made the decision to reverse direction, and ever since that day, the future seems brighter with every title I finish. The protagonist tried to move around him to leave, but the man had him cornered against a bookcase. That one you've got there, though, the patron said, poking a bony finger at the book. It's an upsetting book for sure, but not just because it's beige. It's because it's right. It's right about me and it's right about you. Even though those two tramps are just words written on a page, they're more real than either of us. At least someone wrote a book about them. I figure being the guy who read every book in the library should be enough to convince someone to write a book about me, and then I'll be as immortal as they are. But would you, though? Replied the protagonist. Even if someone did write a book about you, it wouldn't be the same you, would it? It would be some fictionalized image of you, born out of the writer's imagination. It would no more be you than a portrait painted in your likeness. The patron became upset. Well, no one would ever write a book about a nobody like you, he exclaimed, and even if you convince some hack to write it, it's plainly apparent that no one's ever going to read it, that's for sure, he said, turning to look directly at the reader. The man's raised voice caught the attention of the librarian, who glanced up from her paperwork with a slight scowl. The man stormed off. Annoyed, the protagonist once again considered the beige book lying there, waiting patiently for its next victim. He picked it up, surreptitiously hid it in his coat pocket, and scurried out of the library. He returned to the empty lot next door and approached the gruff and unshaven men still huddled around the fire. As they glared at his sudden intrusion into their circle, the protagonist wordlessly tossed the beige book into the flames and left. Well, shall we go? Said one of the gruff men to his companion. Yes, let's go, replied his companion. They do not move.